He left me in my 9th month of pregnancy to live with a girl 10 years younger than me. I was left high and dry when I needed him the most. I found out I was pregnant, but that wasn't even the worst part. I just discovered the whole truth. Honestly, I'm not quite sure how to explain everything, but I'll give it my best shot. I know how strange and unique this situation sounds. If I weren't living it, I probably wouldn't believe it myself. I apologize in advance if my grammar's a bit off. I'm still a little frazzled, so let me backtrack a bit. I've known my ex-boyfriend, David, since we were teenagers. We met when I was 15 and he was 18, living right next to each other in a lovely neighborhood. Not too far from us was this charming little meadow, and just beyond that, hidden among the trees, was a small river. Honestly, I'm not doing it justice here. My English isn't perfect, and I wish I could describe it better, but it was such a beautiful spot. I often used it as a little escape whenever I needed to get away from my parents or just people in general. I always thought I was the only one who knew about that place. But imagine my surprise when I went there one day and found David sitting by the river. We had seen each other around the neighborhood, but that was pretty much it. That day, we started chatting and quickly became close friends. It wasn't romantic, after all. I was only 15 and not at all into dating at the time. He was 18 and wasn't exactly looking for anything long-term either. As we got to know each other better, I met his family. His mom was an absolute sweetheart, while his dad, well, he was full of crude jokes and pretty ignorant, to be honest. David would tell me not to take him too seriously, which I didn't. Then there was his brother, whom I'll call Patrick. To cut to the chase, he was just as awful as their dad. But there was no denying that he loved and cared for David deeply. It was confusing, really. Patrick had such a gross attitude towards women. He was a total sexist, racist, and homophobe, and he wasn't shy about it. Yet, he was fiercely protective of David, which made me feel a mix of sadness and anger. If he could care so much for his brother, then why couldn't he just be a better person? My friendship with David continued to grow, and I want to emphasize that while Patrick was a reflection of their father, David was just like his mother, kind and caring. David's worldview aligned with mine. He wasn't racist or homophobic and often clashed with Patrick because of that. Fast forward a bit, and we became a couple when I was 17 and he was 20. Everything was incredible, and our relationship felt perfect. David wasn't my first boyfriend. I had gotten over my no-dating phase and had dated other guys during our friendship. Honestly, I have no complaints about him as a partner. The real issue was Patrick. He was fine with me when I was just David's friend, but as soon as I became his girlfriend, everything changed. Patrick started treating both of us horribly. Whenever David and I were together, Patrick would call and ask if he was spending time with his little girlfriend, which always led to David hanging up on him and telling him to back off. After those calls, David would come to spend the night with me and apologize, but I'd reassure him it wasn't his fault. He had stood up for me more times than I could count, and I refused to let Patrick's comments get under my skin. I would just ignore him completely whenever I spotted him being rude because he didn't deserve my attention. But this only made Patrick incredibly jealous. He felt like he was losing his little brother, which was just so stressful for everyone involved. Things only started to improve when David finally told Patrick to cut it out or he'd cut him out of his life for good. He made it clear that if Patrick ever made a nasty comment about me, even behind my back, he'd pretend he didn't have a brother anymore. That shook Patrick up a bit, and the comments did stop, although he still rolled his eyes whenever we were together or acted all huffy if he saw us being cute. I could see how much this situation hurt David. He loved his brother despite knowing how nasty and simple-minded he could be. I came from a loving family, but I understood his struggle. There were times he'd break down and cry because Patrick had gotten into trouble again, and it just made me feel so mad and heartbroken. Back then, I didn't really grasp what I know now about abuse and manipulation. Patrick definitely loved David, but he was scared of losing him to someone else. Me. So he tried to manipulate David with comments like, "You know, once this leaves, you'll only have me in this whole world." As the years passed, I remained deeply in love with David, and he felt the same way. By the time I was 22 and he was 25, he started considering studying abroad in France. While the idea sounded dreamy, a big part of me wasn't too keen on the whole thing. My parents were so proud of me for this opportunity, and they had always believed in me, so I didn't want to let them down. At this point, I was still living with my parents, while David had his own apartment with a roommate. Patrick would come by to visit occasionally, and it was clear he still didn't like me. However, since David and I had been dating for so long, I think he just accepted me into his little brother's life. Patrick hadn't changed much with age. Still unpleasant, but a bit more tolerable. One night, when I told David about the potential move, he was visibly shaken. I mentioned that I didn't know what I'd do yet, and we tried to enjoy our date, but the mood just fell apart, and we ended up having a fight. He understood my perspective but reminded me that it wouldn't be just a few hours away. It was France. I tried to explain that many couples make long-distance relationships work, but it was tough. I was totally talking out of my ass, trying to convince him that it wouldn't be that bad. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. But once the heat of the moment passed, we agreed to table the discussion until I figured out what I really wanted to do. The thing is, while the idea of going to France initially started as a way to make my parents proud, the more I thought about it, the more I began to like the idea. I could study literature and journalism there, and it felt like a chance to write a novel about everything I was feeling. Being torn between two worlds and ultimately choosing David every time. But then, this nagging worry crept in. What if I was throwing away a fantastic opportunity? What if I stayed behind and ended up resenting David years down the road? The thought of blaming him for my choices scared me way more than the idea of leaving for a bit and then returning to him. So I made my decision. When I invited him over to talk, I didn't even have to say anything. I was already crying. That led to a massive fight. He begged me not to go, saying he supported my education but that I didn't need to go so far away. He was crying and shouting, and I was doing the same. I reminded him that I'd be leaving in just 2 months and suggested we could do long distance. I promised I wouldn't be gone forever, that I'd come back to him. He was furious and just wasn't hearing me out. He wanted to go home, but I pleaded with him not to, especially because he was angry. The last thing I wanted was for him to drive off while upset. That's one of my biggest fears. Fighting with someone I love and then never seeing them again. He knew that fear of mine, and he stayed, retreating to the living room while I stayed in my bedroom. As night fell, I decided to go fetch him. I didn't want to keep fighting. I found him on the couch, watching TV, still fuming. I asked him to come to bed with me and grabbed his hand. He looked at me for a moment but eventually let me pull him up. We spent the night together, but in the morning he dropped a bombshell. He couldn't do this. He couldn't be with me knowing I'd be leaving. He suggested it would be best to just stop seeing each other now. I started crying right away but didn't ask him to reconsider. I wanted to, but if he felt that way after we spent the night together following such a big fight, there was no way I could change his mind. He kissed me, told me he loved me, and wished me luck. I was a complete wreck. I won't get into all the back and forth I went through over the next few weeks, constantly questioning whether I made the right choice. It was torture. I wanted to call him all the time and beg him to come back, but I held myself back. I even asked my mom to hide my phone from me to avoid the temptation. But eventually I broke. I broke down once and called him. I wanted to text, but the thought of sending a message and then not getting a reply terrified me. That would be awful and leave me with no hope for a second chance. But he didn't pick up. Life went on, and I was miserable, clinging to the idea of France more than ever. Here comes the twist. 2 months after our breakup, I found out I was pregnant. I don't know how much the details of birth control matter, but it was a mistake on both our parts. We didn't use a condom on 2 occasions, and I wasn't on the pill at the time. Now I am. Anyway, I panicked. The trip was just 2 weeks away, but I didn't care about that anymore. All I wanted was to reach out to David, apologize for everything, and tell him we could be a family. But no matter how many times I called, he wouldn't answer. I texted him, but he never even saw the messages. I went to his apartment, only to find out from his roommate that David had gone on a road trip with Patrick. I freaked out and scared his roommate half to death, asking if he knew where they had gone. But his roommate didn't know. They weren't that close. All he could tell me was that David was on a trip with Patrick, and that was it. I sent even more texts, but he never saw them. I tried tracking him down, but it was a dead end. Finally, I decided to write him an email. In my mind, I thought he wasn't seeing my texts because he was on the road, but he had to stop somewhere eventually, right? So I figured he'd see the email and then know what was going on. I poured my heart into that email, telling him everything and begging him to call me as soon as he read it because I needed to talk to him about our baby. This all happened over the course of a week. My trip to France was approaching, and I kept hoping he'd call back or something, but he never did. I was devastated. I couldn't believe the man I had loved for so long, the one I thought was a good person, could just ignore me like that. I kept trying to call, but all I got was voicemail. Eventually, I started receiving notifications that his number couldn't be reached. To say my heart was broken doesn't even begin to capture how I truly felt. I considered waiting until he came back. But if he was ignoring me after I told him I was pregnant, what was the point? In my mind, he hated me and didn't want to see me again. Felt like he was ignoring our unborn child, too. It was the hardest decision I ever made, but I knew I was keeping the baby. I didn't have the luxury of lying in bed, hoping he'd come back. So I took the plunge and traveled to France. I spoke with everyone in charge about my pregnancy, and they said there was no problem at all. I studied hard and had a healthy, beautiful baby girl whom I adore more than anything. For the next 4 years, I focused entirely on my life and my child. I essentially disappeared from everyone back in my hometown, except for my parents. I changed my phone number and never really got into Facebook or Instagram, so I didn't bother keeping up with those platforms. Sure, I lost contact with some good friends, but to be honest, I didn't mind that much. Everything and everyone reminded me of my old life and, of course, David. Fast forward to 8 months ago. I returned to my hometown for the first time in 4 years. My parents offered to let me stay with them, but I rented a cozy little house next to the school where I'm currently teaching. It's just me and my baby girl, and things are okay. Well, we're okay. I knew there was a chance I'd run into David. It's such a small town. While I hoped he might have moved away, I also knew that was unlikely because he really loves this place. It's his home. So one day I ran into him while stuck in traffic. I didn't have my daughter with me, and I was coming back from work. I spotted him on the sidewalk, and he saw me too. Keep in mind, we hadn't had any contact for 4 years. We locked eyes and just stared at each other until the light turned green. He called out my name, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't forgive him. This is already getting long, so I'll fast forward a bit. Over the next few emotionally draining weeks, he found me and kept trying to reach out until I finally snapped at him. My parents were really against me meeting up with him, but I felt like I needed some closure. I just wanted to know how he could have been so horrible to me. I left my daughter with my parents. She was more than thrilled since they spoil her rotten, and headed out to meet David. This is where things get crazy, like really crazy. He tried to make small talk, but I wasn't having any of it. I jumped straight to the point. I asked him how he could do that to me, how he had no remorse for ignoring me when I was pregnant with our child. I wanted to know how he could throw everything we had away just because I wanted to study abroad. He went a little wild, but not in a way that would hurt me. His eyes were wide, and he was shaking, insisting he had never read any of my emails or texts. He kept asking if I was telling the truth and wanted to know if I had kept our baby. I was done playing games, so I pressed him about how he couldn't have seen my messages. He explained that as soon as we broke up, when he left that morning, he told his brother everything. I can only imagine what his brother said about me. Anyway, his brother proposed the road trip and forbade him from bringing his phone along because it was supposed to be. So, Patrick had this plan to help David get over me on what he called a brother's trip. When they got back, Patrick erased all my texts from David's phone. This actually makes sense because the texts I sent never mentioned the pregnancy. Only the email did. So, David could have easily thought I was just trying to apologize or act crazy about getting back together. When I brought up the email, he told me that when he returned and logged onto his computer, there was no email from me. I didn't believe him, though. He kept begging me to trust him, saying I knew him and that he hadn't changed. He insisted that me leaving was the worst thing that ever happened to him and that he would never abandon me or our baby. He wanted to meet her, kept apologizing over and over again. Despite everything, I still left, but something felt off. My heart felt heavy. He sounded sincere, but if he was truly ashamed of what he did, why wouldn't he just admit it? Why come up with such an elaborate lie about not having his phone? It was frustrating, especially when I told him about the email and the pregnancy, and he looked genuinely shocked. The way he kept asking if I was telling the truth made me wonder. Part of me wanted to believe him, but another part just wanted to tell him to screw off. If he was being honest, it meant I spent 4 years believing the father of my child had abandoned us when that wasn't the case at all. I shared everything with my parents, and they seemed surprised too. They advised me to be cautious, suggesting it was more likely a lie and that he just wanted to save face. I tried to let things go and spent the night with my daughter, but a few days later, he asked to meet me again. He kept insisting it was urgent and that if I never wanted to see him again afterward, that would be fine. But I needed to hear him out. Call me weak, but I agreed. When I arrived, he was fuming, shaking with anger. The last time I saw him like that was when we broke up. He had never been violent, but it felt weird seeing him so worked up. I asked him what was so important, and that's when he dropped the bombshell. It was about his brother. Here's why you needed to know the backstory about his relationship with Patrick. Patrick had access to everything. He knew David's passwords, and he had logged into David's email account and deleted the one I sent. I was in shock, just sitting there next to him in silence for a few minutes until I finally managed to ask how I could trust him. David explained that after he found out about our daughter and the texts and emails, he went home and confronted Patrick. Patrick tried to accuse me of lying about the baby, claiming it was probably. He tried to make it sound like I was just trying to make David feel guilty. They argued, and David ended up hanging up on him. I'm not sure if it was remorse or what, but Patrick called him back an hour later and confessed that he had logged in and deleted the email because he was scared David would come back to me and forget all about him. He claimed he hadn't read the email and didn't know about the pregnancy, but I'm pretty sure that's a lie. David told me all of this while he was apologizing, crying, and begging me to believe him. I was just in shock, stunned and frozen in place. If this is true, then all that suffering I went through happened because of Patrick. David kept pleading for my forgiveness, saying he had cut off ties with his brother and that it took everything in him not to go to Patrick's house and confront him. He insisted he would have never abandoned me and understood my anger, but if I could find it in my heart to let him see our baby girl, even just once. He was begging me to believe him until his voice started to crack. I told him I needed time to think. It's been 4 days since that conversation. My parents are shocked, and I can't stop crying. I feel so overwhelmed and can't think straight. For the love of God, I need some advice. Call me stupid, but a huge part of me believes him. Patrick is a piece of work and definitely capable of that kind of manipulation. He was always terrified of losing his brother because David is the only person in the world who could love him, flaws and all. But then, another part of me thinks I'm being naive. David has been giving me space and only messaged me once, saying he's willing to accept whatever I decide. I don't know what to do. I have to think about my daughter. If it's true, then I don't want her to grow up without her dad. If David is genuinely willing to be a father, I don't know. I really need help. This post was deleted, and the user removed it, but I managed to recover it. Here's an update. He abandoned me when I needed him the most. I was pregnant, but I just found out the real truth. I'm completely overwhelmed and stunned by the kindness and support you all have sent my way. Thank you so much. I wish I could have replied to you on the original post, but it was locked. I apologize again for any grammar mistakes. English isn't my first language, so if something doesn't make sense, please let me know. A lot of questions were raised in the original post, which is understandable. I left out many details because I was in a hurry to get to the point and really needed advice. Some things I tried to explain in that post, but I guess they got lost in translation. I'll address the more urgent questions first. My parents were furious, absolutely livid, about how David was ignoring me, and my father even wanted to go over to David's house and confront him. My dad wanted to go knock on David's parents' door, drag him out by the neck and get some answers. I told him not to, which only made him mad at me. My mom was furious too. She insisted I hold David responsible and said if he didn't want to be a parent, at least he should help with child support. After all, he had no trouble conceiving our child. But I was devastated. I didn't want to dive into that subject because, honestly, I thought I could manage on my own. I had money saved up, and I was able to afford a decent life for my baby and me while I was in France. I even got a part-time job at a bookstore there. I didn't want to call David's parents and demand they tell me where their son had gone. I couldn't bring myself to barge in and tell his mom, whom I adored, that her son had gotten me pregnant and then ignored all my attempts to reach him. The idea of going after David for money felt wrong. It would hurt too much to see the man I had loved so deeply, the father of the child I already cherished, being forced into sharing parenthood by paying child support. I didn't want to do any of that because it would mean admitting to myself that David was really ignoring me and the existence of our child. I wasn't thinking straight. I was broken. I knew I should have handled things better and tried harder, but I was terrified and, on top of that, filled with rage. I can't even begin to explain how it felt to be abandoned by someone I loved and trusted so much. In my mind, he didn't want me. I had sent countless texts and an email about our child, but it just didn't seem to be enough. That mistake will haunt me for the rest of my life. Believe me when I say I paid the price. I cried for what felt like forever, and waking up with swollen eyes became my new normal. The first year abroad was incredibly sad. My parents stayed with me for the first few weeks, but then they went back home. I was in a place where people didn't speak my language. While I knew French and could read and write it well enough, speaking it was a whole different ballgame. I'd get nervous and mess up sometimes. I made friends with an American girl, but I didn't let her get too close at first. I remember the first time my baby kicked. I was alone. It was a rush of emotions. I was so happy that this little being was growing inside of me, but when it hit me that David wasn't there to share it with me, I broke down. I cried and talked to my belly, apologizing to her and promising I'd be the best mom in the world. When my parents returned to our hometown, my mom asked me if I was sure I wanted to do this alone and if I really didn't want to get the justice system involved. I told her I was sure. Felt stupid, but that was me at 22 years old. Heartbroken and overwhelmed with pregnancy hormones, I wanted to pretend David didn't exist. I desperately wished I could erase that breakup because I knew if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to properly care for the tiny little human growing inside me. I longed to fast forward to a future where I had 3 decades of motherhood under my belt, so I would know exactly what to do and how to behave. There has been some confusion about my attempts to reach out to him after the breakup. We went no contact, and while he has a Facebook account, I don't, which made it easy for me to avoid him online. I'm very stubborn and proud, so when he left, I decided that was it. I didn't want him and I would move on with my life. But of course, I broke down and gave in, calling him once before I even knew I was pregnant. He didn't pick up, so I tried again and again until I found out about our baby. Once I learned the news, I called him like crazy and texted him too. I didn't want to break the news of my pregnancy over text, though. I wanted to do it in person. That's when I went to his apartment, only to find out from his roommate that he had gone on a road trip with Patrick. By then, we had been completely out of contact, and I had no idea where in the world he could have gone. I tried asking his roommate, but he didn't know either. I mentioned in my original post that David and this guy weren't close. They barely spoke, they just shared an apartment. At that point, I felt pretty hopeless. I really didn't want to go to his parents and tell them what was happening. I wanted to speak to David directly. In my mind, I kept telling myself that the reason he hadn't been responding to my texts or calls was because he was on the road and the signal must be terrible. I let myself believe all sorts of ridiculous theories my mind came up with because I couldn't face the idea that he was actually ignoring me. Meanwhile, the day of my trip was approaching, and I was ready to cancel it if there was any chance David and I could be a family. But postponing the trip wasn't an option. I wasn't flying out to France for a vacation. I was going there to study. Classes were starting soon, and I had this amazing opportunity that I could either take or leave. Since David wasn't picking up, I had to keep the trip as my backup plan. I had no way of tracking him down, especially not knowing where he had gone and refusing to get his parents involved. So, I sent him an email about the pregnancy, explaining that I wanted to tell him face to face, but he had left me no other choice. I figured sooner or later he would stop somewhere and read it. I sent the email exactly 1 week before my trip, giving him enough time to read it and hopefully call me. But he never did. I waited anxiously, to the point where my mother would argue with me because I was so miserable. I could hear her crying to my dad in the next room, and it was all so overwhelming. It's a small town, and the tension was palpable. People were definitely talking about me while I was away. They had no clue I was pregnant. They just knew I had vanished. My parents would call me with updates now and then, letting me know that people were asking where I was. My mom would respond with a calm, polite, "Oh, she's traveling." But inside, I knew the truth was far more complicated. Since I returned, a few people have brought up my trip, but the conversations mostly revolve around my daughter and when I had her. I don't hesitate to tell them I had her while I was away and that I'm a single mom. It's usually enough to shut them up. They get the hint and steer clear of questions about her father. Small towns aren't like the movies where everyone's in your business, desperately wanting updates on your life. People have their own dramas to deal with. Sure, there are gossipers, but I've never paid them any mind. My parents, however, wanted to go to war for me. They were furious and wanted to destroy David and his family for what he did. But I begged them to stop. I just wanted to erase him from my life entirely. I told them to act like he didn't even exist. If they saw him on the street, I demanded they ignore him completely. One day, my mom called me, breathless, to tell me she had run into David at the grocery store. He saw her, but instead of confronting him, she just bolted. Another time, she told me David had knocked on their door late at night, and my parents didn't answer. To him, I was just a girl who had gone on a trip, while my parents viewed him as the scumbag who knocked me up and then ghosted me. It was infuriating trying to explain his actions. David couldn't reach me because I had changed my phone number and set up a new email, which I only shared with my parents and for work-related purposes. I eventually broke down and told my mom I couldn't keep hearing about David anymore. It was suffocating. Every time she mentioned him, it ripped open old wounds. I didn't want to know what he was doing or what was going on in his life. I needed him to vanish from my mind completely. Only my parents and my closest friend knew about my pregnancy. It's not like I was going to parade around town shouting that I was pregnant and abandoned. I'm a fiercely private person. The only person who knew besides my family was my best friend and my baby's godmother. We met in junior high, and even though she moved away, we stayed in touch. She was furious with me for not demanding child support, for just wanting to move on, but she stood by me through it all. I get it. We live in a world dominated by technology and social media, but that doesn't mean I have to expose my life story to everyone if I don't want to. As for mutual friends, I met David when I was just 15 and he was 18. Our social circles couldn't have been more different. The only reason we ever started talking was that chance encounter near that river, a meeting that would change the course of my life forever. When I started dating David at 17, most of my friends were the girls from school. He, on the other hand, hung out with people from his job. Sure, I met some of them, but I was never really close to any of his friends, and he wasn't close to mine. The only exception was my daughter's godmother. As we grew older, while we loved each other, our academic and career interests diverged, leading us to completely different social circles. I was passionate about the arts, poetry, museums, that sort of thing, while David was all about sports, classic cars, and motorcycles. By the time we broke up, he was working as a mechanic, and I have to admit he was damn good at it. Get him talking about a '67 Shelby Mustang, and he could go on for hours, sharing every detail. I always found that fascinating. After all the emotional turmoil, I decided that meeting David first and talking when we were both calm and less shocked would be the best approach. So, the very next day, I texted him, asking if he could meet me at a nice little restaurant near my house after I got off work. He replied almost immediately, agreeing to meet and even offering to give me a ride. I declined, not wanting him to come back to my place. Before I left, I told my baby girl she'd be spending the night with her grandparents. She noticed something was off. Her concerned little face pulled at my heartstrings, making me emotional. I reassured her that nothing was wrong, but inside, I was a wreck. When I arrived to meet David, I was determined to skip the small talk. Surprisingly, I felt a lot calmer than I had the last time we met. He thanked me for agreeing to this meeting and smiled at me, and for a moment it felt like I was staring at the same dorky, boyish smile from 4 years ago. But I told him I was struggling to believe this was really happening. If what he was saying was true, then I couldn't accept that I had wasted 4 years of my life hating and missing him. That realization seemed to hit him hard. He looked down and apologized, saying he couldn't imagine the kind of pain I must have endured. But then he added that he was also having a hard time wrapping his head around the fact that he had a 4-year-old daughter. That's when I decided to confront him about Patrick. David told me that Lunatic had been bombarding him with messages, swearing he hadn't read the email before deleting it, and that he didn't know I was pregnant. David had told Patrick it didn't matter. He had no right to delete anything. Even then, doubts still gnawed at me. I asked David how I could possibly trust him. In response, he pulled out his phone, showing me the entire conversation they had exchanged over text. There were phone calls and voice messages, all filled with Patrick's apologies and pleas. It was like a whirlwind of emotions crashing over me as I tried to make sense of everything. In their last conversation, Patrick texted David, claiming he had done a stupid thing out of love, because he missed his brother. He thought I was just using David like all the others. David showed me his response, which hit me like a punch to the gut. It read, "Out of love or not, your mistake cost me 4 years of my life that I could have spent with my daughter. I can't and will never forgive you for this. You have some serious problems, and I hope you get treated. But I can't feel anything for you except pity. I don't ever want to see you or contact you again." I read that message over and over again, each word resonating deeply as I scrolled through the conversation. It became clear that David had been ignoring and arguing with Patrick since the day I told him about the baby. While he could have easily fabricated all of this, I was starting to believe him more than ever. He told me he had been true to his word and had cut Patrick out of his life for good. The weight of that realization crashed over me, and I couldn't help but start crying. Not sobbing, but silent tears rolling down my cheeks. David bit his bottom lip, waiting patiently for me to compose myself. I told him this felt too surreal, and I apologized for my mixed emotions. I admitted that a part of me still hated him, and he nodded, understanding. After a few seconds of silence, I finally told him our daughter was amazing. His face lit up with a beaming smile at that. He asked me how she was, eager for every detail. I shared everything about her. What she loves, what she hates. When I mentioned that she hates peas, he laughed, saying he hated them too. Then, he hesitated for a moment and asked if he could meet her. I felt a pang of uncertainty. There was still so much we needed to discuss. I asked him if his parents knew, and he replied that they were aware. He had fought with Patrick but didn't tell them why. He thought it was something we should discuss together. We ended up talking about everything throughout the night, including our dating lives since we broke up. He had a long-term relationship with a girl that lasted 2 years, but he broke up with her. I only had a few flings as I was focused on my studies and taking care of my baby, leaving me no time for serious relationships or even contemplating falling in love again. When we finished dinner, I finally told him he could meet our daughter. I can't even begin to describe his reaction. It was so sincere that it melted my heart. Tears filled his eyes, and before I knew it, I was crying too. I was pretty sure everyone in the restaurant was staring at us, but he kept thanking me over and over. I reminded him that we would take it slow and not drop the bomb on her right away, and he agreed. I thought we were doing a good job of keeping our conversation focused on our daughter and filling in the gaps of our past. But as we were about to leave, he stood a little too close and said, "I still find you to be the most beautiful girl in the world." His words hung in the air, igniting a storm of emotions inside me. He used to tell me that a lot, even when we were just friends at 15 and 18. I smiled at him, unsure of how to respond, and we agreed to meet the next day at my place. The day after, I finally let him meet our daughter. I introduced her to him as a friend of mine. My baby girl is still so little. She's incredibly smart and funny, always chatting away, but she also loves to play and do her own thing. She was very sweet to David, who was clearly trying hard not to cry in front of her. It wasn't sadness. He was just overwhelmed with emotions. We had dinner together, and I encouraged my daughter to share her favorite things with him, her favorite TV shows, toys, everything. She chatted for hours while David nodded, smiled, and engaged with her. At one point, she mentioned how much she loves horses, and David exclaimed that he loved them too. I had to stifle a laugh, knowing he was secretly terrified of them. My grandfather owns a farm, and we used to spend holidays there, but David always refused to get on a horse, convinced he'd fall and break every bone in his body. After a while, my daughter looked at me and asked if she could go play with her toys. I glanced at David and saw the sadness in his eyes. I tried to get her to stay with us a bit longer, but David himself said it was okay, so I let her go. Watching them interact was bittersweet. It tugged at my heart in ways I wasn't prepared for. Once she was gone, David and I talked and cried, which seemed to be our new normal. He told me how gorgeous our daughter was and that she had his blonde hair. He apologized again for everything that happened, and we discussed the idea of seeing a therapist for the three of us. We decided not to tell our daughter right away that the nice man she just met is actually her father. David will keep visiting every day to get to know her better, and then we'll tell her. We also need to think about telling his parents, which is something we're unsure about, whether to do it now or wait until after we tell our daughter. Any advice on that would be greatly appreciated. Right now, David is downstairs with our baby girl, and she's making him watch Adventure Time. I'll update when we finally tell her and his parents. As for David and me, we're focusing on our daughter right now. I realize that I'll never fully know the whole truth. I don't doubt David's words as much as I did before, but like I said, I'll never know if he truly cut Patrick out of his life. Still, seeing the texts and hearing about the phone calls is reassuring. What worries me the most is Patrick. To be honest, I'm terrified of that man. I'm keeping my eyes open. I don't know if he would go so far as to tell David's parents, but I fear he might, not out of concern for me or our daughter or even David, but because Patrick knows exactly what he did. It doesn't matter if he read the email before deleting it. The consequences of his actions have impacted everyone, including an innocent baby. I adore David's mom. She's always been so sweet and caring toward me. But his father, he's horrible, not much different from Patrick. I remember the first time David took me to his home before we were even dating. He warned me to just ignore his father. I can only imagine how devastated his mom will feel about this whole situation, but I dread to think of his father's reaction. We're definitely considering seeing a counselor. That sounds like a great idea. Thank you for the suggestion.